reasons for the war change almost every day, which they do seem to do, which, you know, if there was even a coherent excuse for a war, it ought to be the same coherent lying excuse. Give Blair his due there. He kept up with the same lie. He didn't change it every day. But they get in a pickle with the lies, because one of the reasons, of course, that we went, one of the main reasons, right from the beginning, and they still come up when it's that day of the week that this is the reason, is democracy. We're trying to introduce democracy into Afghanistan, and they're doing this despite the fact that they have gone to the most extraordinary lengths to install in Afghanistan as leader a man who came to be the leader through an election that then immediately had to be rerun because the election was corrupt. And that was the democratically elected leader that they've put in there, to the extent that an organisation called, a human rights group called Transparency International, I know, has published a league table of the world's most corrupt countries, in which Afghanistan came second after Somalia, such as the achievement there so far. And I can't help thinking that Karzai was probably a little bit put out by that and felt that he could have won it, really. He's probably a bit cross with Somalia and thinks, well, we could have won that if only we bribed the right judges. But that's the achievement on that. Gordon Brown, a beleaguered Gordon Brown, said during the election campaign, when Afghanistan was mentioned as it was so rarely, that, when in answer to this charge, that in order to deal with corruption we seem to have installed a corrupt regime, he said, we are hoping for some early action on this corruption. Which is, I wonder how early it can be when you've spent 8 years in a war to think, well, in a fairly early stage of the next part of this, part after the 8 years, we've been, how on earth is the nonsense of it, the complete incoherence of it. Yes, we are going to deal with the corruption that we're there, that we've installed, having promised to get rid of it in the first place, because it's only been 8 years. You think even a builder, even the worst builder, after 8 years of doing absolutely nothing, if you said, well, are you going to start any point soon, wouldn't say we're going to have one more cup of tea, because we do want to get an early start, and we'll only be a few more minutes. This is completely incoherent, even by poor beleaguered Gordon Brown's standard in those moments. And the people that are underneath Karzai, the Asian Times, there's a report in the Asian Times, US and NATO contingents spend hundreds of millions of dollars annually on Afghan security providers, most of which are local warlords guilty of human rights abuses. So even if you say that this was a war that was in order to install democracy and get rid of the warlords, fair dues, they have got rid of some of the warlords, and they've replaced them with other warlords who are guilty of human rights abuses, but we're now paying hundreds of millions of pounds for them. None of that makes sense. The argument, if you can remember back to when the war first started, that it was the heroin trade. This was the argument that was on the front pages of papers and came out of the politicians' mouth, both in Britain and America, almost every day. If you were against it, don't you care about the heroin? What about the heroin? If you don't care about anything else, what about that? There's now 3 times the production of opium that there was at the time. So again, an extraordinary achievement there. And of course, one of the ones that every now and again they come up with when they get a bit flustered, as they did at the beginning, women's rights. We're aiming to introduce women's rights. That's what our role is out there in the Middle East. That's what we're particularly proud of. And I always think, of course, yes, because that is what we do. We can't stand a country that is so appalling on women's rights. That's why we only sell hundreds of millions of dollars worth of arms every year to feminist countries like Saudi Arabia. Without being sold a Virago book. Every one of the arguments makes so little sense. The idea of terrorism being the reason, so many ridiculous flaws in that argument. The 7-7 bombers came from Leeds, are they next? This is all the inquiries that are coming out about Iraq from senior people in the intelligence say that in Iraq it clearly made the threat of terrorism in this country far, far more serious, which is something that, all right, they now say that, but of course anyone with any sense who paid a fleeting glance to the situation knows that that was absolutely the case. And yet, all of these things now that come out of these sort of leaks that have come out that Lindsay was referring to today, again, the incoherence of their arguments, that they say, I know it's one of the, just saying this in the news before I was coming out, the argument seems to be, but these civilian casualties that we were that have been talked about, they were about 4 or 5 years ago. They've stopped now. This was a report that was about 4 or 5 years ago. If only the report had come out a year later, if only these leaks dealt with a slightly later period, we'd put a stop, as if it was just some sort of bureaucratic error. We forgot to keep killing civilians, but we got that right. Of course it's a nonsense. And if there is one document, if you like, that wasn't just leaked, but that is official, that really tells you, I think, why these civilian casualties get killed and why it's not just a matter of a mistake here and an error there and the wrong bit of paper being filled in, or they forgot to tick the box that said we don't want civilian casualties. The Savile inquiry, there was one little passage in that I think was so important because it was about so much more than Northern Ireland, where it talked about how in that situation the soldiers started to see every civilian in the area as a potential terrorist as part of the enemy. And of course that's the case. Of course when you're an occupying army that becomes more and more unpopular, of course that's the case. Everybody is a potential enemy, everyone's a potential threat, they don't want you there, and so everybody therefore is liable to end up on this list of civilian casualties, whether or not that gets leaked. All of that is the case. And yet, Lindsay said, so much opposition to it, so brilliant that people like Joe Glenton. It's an extraordinary courageous thing that he did, Joe. And yet, the way that he's dealt with, put in jail for this, what that means now in this peculiar country, it means that if you tell the truth to try to stop a war, you are put in jail. However, if you tell a series of lies in order to try and start a war, then 7 years later you'll be called for 5 minutes for an inquiry and then let go to make millions of pounds speaking around the world. Incoherence of it, the idea we have to jail people like Joe Glenton as a warning.